Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Crisis in Northern Syria, Threats and Opportunities. My name is Meghan Bodette, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Kurdish Peace Institute, a nonpartisan research and policy institute dedicated to pursuing and understanding non-derivative understanding of Kurdish issues and the regions in which the Kurds live. And today we have a very timely and very relevant topic. Since the fall of the Assad regime on December 8th, 2024, there's a potential for an end to 14 years of civil war in Syria. But at the same time, in the Kurdish majority regions of the Northeast, we might see conflict reignite along lines that have destabilized that region and caused serious humanitarian and security crises for years prior to these developments. Turkey right now, after successfully capturing by means of Turkey-backed Syrian National Army militias, SDF territories to the west of the Euphrates River in the Shaba region, home to tens of thousands of internally displaced persons from Afrin, and then the Arab majority city of Manbij, Turkey and the SNA have now turned their sights to Kobani, a historic Kurdish city symbolic of the Kurdish victories over ISIS 10 years ago in 2014, early on in the conflict, and the start of the Kurdish alliance with the US-led global coalition that led to the territorial defeat of ISIS in the region. Turkey has long seen not only Kobani, but all of the Kurdish majority regions on the Syrian border as a target, viewing the Syrian Democratic Forces and the affiliated civilian administration, the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, as a security threat. Now, resolving this crisis is essential to ensuring a smooth and stable political transition in Syria, preventing the marginalization of Kurdish people that contributed to developments in Syria's northeast and some of the instability that took place during Syria's civil war, and ensuring that ISIS does not return and other extremist groups, including some that make up Syria's new government, don't pose a threat to other Middle Eastern countries, the US, and Europe. Now, with us today to discuss these critical topics, we have two very accomplished speakers who are experts on these issues, who have been providing a great deal of very interesting and relevant commentary. We'll be hearing from Yusuf Can, coordinator of the Wilson Center's Middle East program, and Mohammed A. Salih, the non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. So Yusuf and Mohammed, thank you for your participation. I'm going to start off with a question to Yusuf. So as we touched on, and as anyone following this discourse in Washington is going to see, the consensus is that Turkey is the winner, so to speak, of these events in Syria with the fall of Assad and the Syrian transition. How is the Turkish government approaching Syria now, and what is it broadly that they would like to achieve?
Thank you so much, Meghan, for inviting me to speak on this matter. Again, my name is Yusuf. I'm the coordinator for the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. And I'll be talking about Turkey today, as Meghan said. So the first thing I want to clarify from my perspective, and I think a lot of other people in Turkey, from Turkey, would think in a similar way, is that the notion of labeling Turkey as the main winner or the winner of what's happening in Syria today, it's still, I think, is a premature description of what's happening, and also potentially self-reinforcing. It's too early, honestly, to describe Turkey as the main winner, but I do think that undeniably Turkey does occupy a position of great advantage, not just because of what's happening in Damascus, but in the whole region, in broader Syria too. Whether that's because of its military involvement in Syria, both with its support to SNA or its relationship with the Kurds in northeast Syria, or whether it's because of potential economic investments that Turkey will hope Turkish businesses will participate in Syria, rebuilding Syria, or whether that's resettling Syrian migrants from Turkey to Syria. There's a lot of positions of advantage for Ankara. That's how they that's at least an undeniable reality for what's happening. But at the same time, I do want to underline the fact that what's good for, or what's a win for, or what's advantageous for Erdogan and his government doesn't necessarily mean it's advantageous for the Turkish society as a whole. In fact, there've been many occasions where those two things did not really overlap. And we can expand on that later. But I do think that it's, yes, Turkey has a lot of advantages. In fact, I think either the day or the next day after the fall of Damascus, the stock market values of cement or construction companies in Turkey have risen, and this continues to happen. This is a trend that still continues in the sense that Turkish businesses are very excited about what's happening. Whether it's logistics companies, trade companies, construction companies, people see a great opportunity there, and those businesses more often than not have ties to Ankara or the Erdogan government. So yes, there's who's going to be the winner of this whole Syria situation is still, I think, too premature to make a strong statement as Turkey as the winner, because again, it's too early. But I think Turkey does have advantages to achieve. And to answer your question, a couple of things. One is the security concern that we're going to be talking about today, but that's one opportunity that Turkey has to solve what it perceives as a security problem in its southern border, especially with regards to northeast Syria. Second issue is the migrant issue, refugee issue. However, that's more complicated. I don't think a lot of people realize how established Syrian refugees are in Turkey to a certain degree. Not all of them, but many of them. And obviously, the bigger thing, the more major, the more important, the overarching achievement Erdogan seeks to accomplish is to have more of a say in what's happening in the region beyond Syria, whether that's Iraq, whether that's Gaza, whether that's Gulf. Turkey or Iran or Turkey does want to have more of a say. And last but not least, it helps whether or not this is backed by statistics. It's not really backed by statistics yet because it's too early to speak, as I said, but it does boost. There's a possibility that it can boost Erdogan's image at home in Turkey, in Turkish domestic politics, with the caveat that it's more likely to consolidate his voter base than actually get more votes for him. So we'll see how Turkey is able to achieve any of these goals that it sets. But yeah, I think I'm going to end it there.
Well, we do always like to challenge the conventional wisdom, and I think that you bring up some very important points for analysts and policymakers to remember, particularly this idea borne out by the past several years of Erdogan's government's behavior in Syria and elsewhere, that what's good for Erdogan and his affiliates might not be always what's advantageous or successful for the people of Turkey as a whole. And now we talk about the other side of the border and the position of the Syrian Kurds, which, as has been mentioned, is what Ankara is seeing as its sort of number one perceived security threat right now and for the past several years as well. So the SDF and the Autonomous Administration have taken some significant losses lately. As I mentioned earlier, they've lost control of the Shaba region and of Manbij. Right now, there's a fragile ceasefire brokered by the United States that was extended to last through the end of the week. It is holding with no territorial changes so far, though clashes along the ceasefire lines are being observed up to this very moment. And so, Mohammed, I want to turn to you to talk a bit about the outlook for the SDF and the Autonomous Administration and for the Syrian Kurdish population as a whole. What is the position of that region like right now, and what do you expect is going to happen in the Northeast?
Well, thank you so much, Megan. It's a pleasure to be with you and Yusuf on this panel. To answer your question, I should say that the Syrian Kurds in general are in a very tough position. It's a very fluid situation over there, and the ceasefire, as you also just pointed out, is not really very firm and reliable. anything is possible. We have seen that Turkey and the Syrian National Army groups that it backs have been challenging and violating the ceasefire to some extent over the past few days. Speaking, with the people in northeast Syria, the people who are on the ground, you get a sense of panic and anxiety among the civilians over there. There's, however, a sense of resistance, also a willingness to put up resistance against any, invasion by Turkey or the SNA groups in the Kobani area or elsewhere in the region. But all things considered, really, things are not in a good place, and a lot depends on two major actors here. Number one, Turkey, what Turkey wants to do, what essentially the Turkish plans are, and what it is trying to achieve in northeast Syria at the moment or in the coming weeks and months. And also what the US is willing to do versus what it can do. There has been quite some criticism of the US conduct so far. The positive thing is that, the US has been able to get a couple of ceasefires in the Manbij area and also in the Kobani area. But again, the situation is really very volatile, and there is no guarantee that the ceasefire is going to continue. All of this, to put it in a nutshell, to wrap up, puts both the SDF and the Autonomous Administration of Northeastern Syria in a very difficult position. At this particular moment, even the very survival of the administration of Kurdish control over the Kurdish majority parts of northeastern Syria is in question, is in doubt, and so we'll have to wait and see how the developments are going to unfold in the coming days and weeks.
Absolutely. I think that you point out accurately that Kobani is a flashpoint and is going to be a flashpoint. I think some of you listening to this have been there. What I'll never forget is right on the border, at the very outskirts of the city, there's an area where there's a cemetery of the people killed in a large ISIS bombing that targeted the city just a few months after the liberation. And then looming down over this cemetery, the civilian neighborhood that it's in, the farmlands right by the border, is a Turkish military base right on the adjacent hill. And I'll never forget, standing there, I visited with some friends to pay respects to the victims of ISIS there, and seeing this lack of separation, really lack of distance between this, site commemorating the sacrifices people made to defeat ISIS and the ongoing, threat from a possible Turkish incursion. This is going to be for all of the cards for the Syrian Kurds, and from Turkey's perspective, for all of the cards in terms of advancing its position in Syria as well. And that's why I think this diplomacy to avoid a worst case scenario in Kobani and elsewhere is very important. We're going to get to that a bit later in the discussion in terms of what the US can do. And now, Yusuf, going back to you. When we talk about diplomacy and outcomes for Northeast Syria, we always have to remember that there was a chance, how strong or weak, is a matter of historical debate for many different people, that the Turkish-Kurdish relationship, domestically within Turkey and between Turkey and northern Syria, could have gone very differently. During the peace process between Turkey and the PKK, which took place from 2013 to 2015, instead of fighting in northern Syria, Ankara was meeting with Syrian Kurdish politicians and allowing, some sort of dialogue to take place. Obviously, that process collapsed, and there was really no hint of moderation from the point of view of either side until about 2 months ago, when reporting suggested that there was talk of a possible return to the peace process and possible ongoing negotiations. And far-right nationalist Action Party leader Devlet Bahçeli, who's Erdogan's coalition partner, called on imprisoned PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan to address the Turkish parliament and declare an end to the PKK's armed conflict. Obviously, developments in Syria have shifted the equation for all parties there. Do you see any chances of renewed dialogue to address the broader Turkish-Kurdish conflict now, or has Syria changed the balance too much?
Thank you so much, Megan, for that question. To basically answer your question, I don't think obviously Syria impacted that process, is going to impact the process, but I don't think the actors who actually wanted to restart that dialogue process have changed their mind 180 degrees because what's happening in Syria. Um, the reason why I'm saying that is because, like this first time this happened, and back in 2013 and 2015, these conversations were not really public. We learned the details about most of it, at least afterwards, after the fact, after it failed, honestly. And one of the reasons why it failed was because it wasn't really public. There were a lot of secrets, a lot of unknowns from both sides, from all actors, and that was one of the main criticisms that took that were that basically was vocalized by the opposition parties, but also general public, Turkish public. Now we didn't know what was happening really. And it's kind of similar right now. That's why it's really hard to speculate or honestly analyze what we should expect from a so-called renewed peace process, because yes, a lot of people were surprised by Bahçeli's comments and his remarks about Öcalan leaving prison, and then PKK dissolving itself from being a military organization and so forth. The reason why it's really hard to actually, speculate or contemplate about what might happen and what the impact of Syria is going to be is because it's, again, it's very secretive. It's very behind the curtain type of conversation. And honestly, I don't think that helps the topic itself, because um, people are what people expect from such a process is, as you said, peace and more diplomacy, um, better rights, and I don't know, within the Turkish legal framework for Kurds and so forth. But the issue is we don't know what Ankara or Erdogan-Bahçeli coalition wants from this. One of the obvious ones is that a constitutional change in Turkey, get the help of Kurds, passed, make sure that Erdogan can run again and stays in power and so forth. So using Kurds for that kind of a political maneuver is one of the reasons why people think that this is taking process, and it's a legitimate one. But there are other reasons why this is happening, and obviously they're tied to Syria and the security concerns of Turkey. Um, Meaning that some people, I argue that there's Ankara or Erdogan government wants to restart this peace process, or is still they're on, or wants to continue a peace process with the Kurds in Turkey, particularly, is to ensure Kurds in Turkey and Kurds in Syria and Kurds in Iraq don't converge in terms of interests and in terms of a future together. That's one of the other reasons why to put a set basically between the Kurds in Syria and Kurds in Turkey. But I don't think that's actually a very realistic approach, because if we all recall what happened when the first peace process collapsed in Turkey, and the Kobane, after the whole the reason why Selahattin Demirtas is in prison today is what happened during those, is because of what happened during those days, that the opposition against Erdogan's presidency and so forth. So and because the Kurdish people in Turkey are not really separable in terms of their ties to the Kurds in Syria. That's an elite peace process. I don't think will achieve that separation. Um, one thing that I do find kind of weird and interesting is the fact that lately in the Turkish parliament, if you watch the conversations between the Kurdish members and Turkish members, nationalist members, or the Dem Party members, is that they seem to have an actually really friendly relationship. I'm not just talking about Devlet Bahçeli handshaking Kurdish ministers or smiling at them, but the conversations are too friendly, as a matter of fact. Even after the appointment of trustees by Ankara to, the democratically elected municipalities, not just in eastern Turkey, but in Istanbul too. I find that kind of awkward, and I don't think the public, in general, the public consensus is positive towards that, because it's to take a step back, and I'm going to end it there, but it kind of like indicates this politician and public divergence in terms of interests and in terms of realities. Because at the end of the day, those are still political elites, whether Kurdish or Turkish. There's still this uh, the interests don't seem to overlap, and I don't think really the political elite sees that. And whether it's Kurds or Turks, I don't think people are really fond of the way this so-called renewed peace process is happening. People don't know what's happening. That causes anxiety, and pe and with what's happening in Syria, I do think that people are not going to be at least getting a. Let me end it here. I don't think it's going to be as easy to get the consent of the public as it happened back in 2013 or 14, because at the time, a lot of nationalist people even were quite happy with, Erdogan was the guy who was going to solve the Kurdish problem, quote unquote, in Turkey. Didn't happen. And then that caused a lot of trauma for Turks and Kurds alike. So I'm going to end it right there.
Yeah, you bring up some very important points there. I think particularly about that elite public separation. Something I hear from a lot of Kurdish people and from politicians as well in a sort of self-criticism is that the previous process was very secretive. And when that happens, you don't build the public support that's needed when the process gets rocky to put pressure on leaders and to say that they have to stick to the commitments that they made. So I think it's important that we keep discussing this on both sides and thinking about how to sort of engage the public and build that public support, because that's going to be something that both sides and any international actor interested in supporting peace are going to have to consider. And this is also a great setup with your remarks about the position of the Kurds in Turkey and the Kurdish opposition for the question that I wanted to bring to you, Mohammed, because as we all know, Syria is not the only country that has a Kurdish population. In fact, the Syrian Kurdistan, or Rojava, is what Kurds see as the smallest part of Kurdistan, with a population of about 2 to 4 million Kurds, with many more Kurds in Turkey, Iran, and of course in Iraq, which has an autonomous Kurdish government. So what are the positions of different Kurdish political and military actors, in Kurdish society as a whole? How are they looking at this situation in Syria? And what do you think that they might do? And I'd be particularly interested in Iraqi Kurdistan and the KRG here, as they do have that autonomous authority.
Well, the stakes are really high for the Kurds at the moment. So Kurds everywhere across the region are really, following what's happening in Syria with a lot of concern. Let's forget not that, the Rojava administration, or the Kurdish-led northeastern administration in Syria has been one of the only two Kurdish self-ruled entities in the region. And when you look at that in the broader context of a century of Kurdish struggle to achieve some measure of self-rule in the region, is a very remarkable achievement, especially given that Syria was never really thought to be one of the early places for that sort of Kurdish self-rule entity to emerge. So given what has been happening since 2018, the attacks by Turkey and the Syrian groups that it backs, and the demographic change that a lot of Kurds consider to be really an ethnic cleansing campaign happening in northern Syria, there is a lot of worry and concern, that situation is going to be extended to the other parts of northeast Syria. It is really important for Kurds, both on a strategic level, but also on a psychological level. In terms of Iraqi Kurdistan, there isn't really a unified position that has been articulated so far. But it is fair to say, judging from what we have seen since 2018 up until now, that there is a great degree of concern in terms of the fate of the, Syrian Kurdish-led administration in northeastern Syria. It's very important for Iraqi Kurdistan from a strategic perspective, because if that administration is going to be removed, despite the differences and the disagreements, in particular between the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Northeast Syria administration, the end or the termination of the Kurdish administration in Syria would be a very major blow for Iraqi Kurds as well. This time around, the KRG leadership and the KDP leadership have been silent, but we have seen that in the past, when Turkey was attacking Afrin, or in 2019 when they were attacking Sarakaniye and Tel Abyad, those areas, public statements or expressions of concern were made by the KDP and KRG leaders. At the current moment, they seem to not want to, sort of publicly come out and talk about it, probably mostly because of, their perceptions of Turkish pressure or reaction. But this is really something that the public, in particular in Iraqi Kurdistan, is very much, concerned about. People are following this very closely. And there is a very strong sense of intra-Kurdish solidarity when it comes to the fate of Rojava, in particular at the level of the public. You also mentioned, that the fate of historically there has been a very close relationship between Kurds in Turkey and Syria. So the fate of both areas, both regions are in a way very closely tied as well. Any breakthrough in terms of Turkish-Kurdish relations inside Turkey will reflect quite positively on the fate of Kurds in Syria as well. So all in all, it's a really very worrying development, and Kurds are following it very closely and hoping that there would be some sort of a scenario where the northeastern administration of Syria would not collapse.
Absolutely. I think, it goes back to we're having this conversation with Kobani being the flashpoint. And what's really important, I was saying this on Ruda the other night, in Kobani, right, you had different Kurdish parties and different Kurdish communities across geographic and political lines unite to support the YPG, the YPJ, and the people of Kobani themselves in the defense of that city. The KRG sent Peshmerga forces to join the battle. The PKK sent its own armed forces to join the battle. Many young Kurdish men and women from different parts of Kurdistan, while the entire world was feeling this threat of ISIS and countless people were fleeing, these young people ran towards that border at great personal risk to join the fight and help their fellow Kurdish people in the defense of that city. And that kind of unity was something that brought Kurds in both Iraq and Syria their greatest level of international support in their fight against ISIS, and some of their greatest military and political successes. So I think that there's, a lot of lessons there for what Kurdish actors can do and might want to do, and how their publics might be feeling, in terms of acting together to strengthen their position on this. And then another thing that we remember when we think back to, the Battle of Kobani in 2014 is, of course, that this was, as I said, the site where the United States first made the policy choice to start partnering with the YPG and the YPJ, which would become the core of the SDF, in order to fight against ISIS. Now, that has been described as a temporary, tactical, and transactional relationship, but it has now lasted about 10 years and survived some very challenging developments, whether the withdrawal in 2019 or changing relations between the US and Turkey. And what's been clear in all of these discussions is, as much as there are internal Turkish concerns and internal Kurdish concerns, this is a conflict where there is a US interest in seeing some kind of peace and stability and being able to end, another one of what many in Washington call these endless wars in a way that doesn't require the US to have to go back in and solve problems militarily 10 years later from now. So what the US is going to do now for the stability and security of Syria, for Turkey, for the Kurdish people, is going to be really important for that region and for wider issues that the US cares about, like ISIS. So, what I'd like to ask both of you is your ideas for the top 2 or 3 things that you would recommend that US policymakers do now to manage this crisis and promote some sort of more stable, more secure outcome. Yusuf, I'll go over to you.
Thank you so much, Megan. I think this is a hard question. Well, the main reason for that is because we're in a transitional period, not just in Syria, but in the United States, too. And we have a new administration coming, and they, at least in theory, have a different approach to Syria, or foreign policy in general. I'm talking about the Trump administration and its involvement in Syria. But I think taking a step back and talking about Syria in general, not just Turkey or northern Syria, but Syria's stability in general is one thing that the United States, and it's not limited to the US, but West in general, but US in particular, should not necessarily disregard as unimportant. There's a very small window of opportunity when it comes to Syria, in my opinion. Um, Economic issues, social issues, political issues. It's a war-torn country. Its people are displaced. Infrastructure is, you know, is barely. Yes, it's providing some services, but there's a lot of need for economic investment, for investment in its people, youth, women, all of the shebang basically. And without U.S. support to that, without international Western support to that, which entails lifting of sanctions, which entails supporting investments in Syria, which entails investments in its people. And that starts with U.S. involvement, whether that's the best possible scenario or not, at least in this moment, without Washington support for lifting sanctions, for ensuring that economic investment, flows to Syria, economic aid flows to Syria, especially parts where people are already, have been suffering for so long. So that's one, I think, the first thing that U.S. should organize this international support for Syria's stability in Damascus and beyond. And that, by the way, includes Gulf too. This conversation, because in a scenario where Turkey is the leading actor, is not going to make a lot of people. It's going to make some people unhappy. That's Gulf countries, and not all of them, but at least Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Are not really going to be fond of that. Yes, Turkey and Qatar have a different kind of relationship. They've even when Ibrahim Kalın, the head of Turkish intelligence, was in Damascus in the same car with Jolani, Qatari intelligence chief was, I think, in that car too. So the Turkey and Qatar have a different type of relationship. But yes, U.S. whether lifting sanctions or not, whether or not it has concerns about HDS and how it's going to govern Syria, and they are legitimate concerns. At the end of the day, punishing Syrian people, for crimes that not even been committed yet, because sanctions were on Assad regime, not innocent people in Syria. So I think that's one part of the conversation, and not missing the window of opportunity here. The second thing is not leaving the region in a way that's going to let it dissolve into a crisis again, or not necessarily civil war, but military conflict tensions. Yes, Trump wants to disentangle itself, the United States, from not just Syria, but the world's problems that quote unquote don't concern the U.S. But I think leaving Syria too early could cause issues, and potentially encourage people who want to have more of a say in Syria through violent means, including ISIS. And apparently, it seems like the U.S. is already, dealing with an insurgence of ISIS threat in Syria. So that's the second thing. And the third last thing I think I want to say before giving the floor to Mohammed is I think the U.S. could talk to all and they are already talking to all the actors in the region, inside Syria or outside Syria. But I think doing that sometimes, not always, but more openly, would be also helpful in terms of making sure that we all understand, not we all, but making sure people understand where other countries stand and how much involvement other countries want to have in Syria. That would help Syrian psyche, in my view. Obviously, I can't put myself in anybody's shoes in Syria or any country of similar conditions. But one thing I would want to know at least that who's willing to be there, who's willing to do what. That would, I think, encourage Syrian people. Because at the end of the day, it's up to Syrians, including Kurds, because I think oftentimes people forget that Kurds in Syria are Syrian people. And or all the ethnicities. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to be about how Syrian people want to move forward in terms of governance, in terms of what kind of political regime, political structure they want to live under. But I think having a open conversation is very important, so that Syrian people know what people are, what people want in Syria and how they can potentially get involved.
Yeah, all great points. Mohammed, your viewpoint?
Well, if we were to talk about policy recommendations for the U.S. Administration, or more broadly for the Western governments, I would say the first order of business should be really no more military operations by Turkey and the Syrian National Army groups. That is true for the current lame duck administration of President Biden, but also true for the incoming administration of Trump. So the first and the most important thing is really to ensure that the current ceasefire will hold and will last. The second thing would be to broker talks between the SDF and the autonomous administration more broadly and Turkey. A lot of people, when speaking about Turkey and the Kurds, a lot of people tend to see it in terms of a zero-sum game, or some sort of a primordial hostility that has been there for centuries or for a long time between Turkey and the Kurds. But that is really not true. And despite the course of events over the past century or several decades, there is very much an opportunity for win-win outcomes in the case of Turkey and the Kurds, whether that's inside Turkey or in this case between Turkey and the Syrian Kurds. And I think the burden of that would mostly fall to the incoming Trump administration, given that the present administration is in a lame duck period. So it's really very important for the future administration to ensure that the SDF, that the Syrian Kurds, in all their diversity, be that the autonomous administration or the Kurdish National Council groups, sit down with Turkey at a negotiating table and try to work out their relationship. I think there's also the model of Iraqi Kurdistan and Turkey's relationship, which could be instructive and useful for the future format of the relations between Syrian Kurds and Turkey, even though that relationship also has its own particularities and characteristics. And just looking back on that Iraqi Kurdish and Turkish relationship, being able really to see the picture in the long run, that that the current hostile relationship actually has a potential to be turned into something which is cooperative, which is friendly, or at least where there is some sort of a functional relationship, both on the diplomatic level, but also at the level of trade and investment, which Turkey is very well positioned to conduct, in all parts of Syria, given the strength and the resources of Turkish businesses and industries. The third thing I would say for the US government would be to support the SDF to join the political process in Damascus. I should say, more broadly, the Syrian Kurds. Again, that also requires making sure that the different wings of the Syrian Kurdish political spectrum come together, agree on a shared platform, and go to Damascus with that sort of platform in mind. what is really, sort of what brings extra value to supporting this sort of arrangement, supporting, Syrian Kurdish involvement in the future of Syrian political process is that, SDF has a lot of experience in governance. It also had the experience in terms of being, able to forge a pretty diverse and broad-based administration in the areas under its control. So the SDF model can really also work, as a blueprint for the future of Syria, a future, where the rights of different religious groups, different sects, different ethnic groups are respected, are protected, and a sort of a Syrian Kurdish presence in Damascus can also really become, a coalition for for the broader secularist, liberal, and civic-minded Syrian political forces to all come together in addition to the representatives of other minority groups, be that, the Alawites, the Druze, and the Christians. So the SDF can really serve at that nucleus in the future of Syria to ensure that the influence of the Islamist forces in Damascus are counterbalanced. And outside of the SDF, the Syrian political landscape is really dominated by varying stripes of Islamist forces. So it's also in the US and Western strategic interest to realize the value of the SDF and the Syrian Kurds more broadly in terms of ensuring, a fairer, a more just future for all of these Syrians.
Absolutely. I think all of those recommendations that both of you put forward are things that policymakers should be considering and likely will be considering. Yusuf, your point about Syrian Kurds being Syrian citizens, part of Syria, is something that I think a lot of people do need to remember. I see a lot of discourse that posits, Kurds and Syrians as though these are two separate people. And that attitude that Syrian Kurds are foreigners was really the root of a lot of the Assad regime's oppression of Kurdish people, making over 100,000 Kurds stateless and treating them essentially like not part of that society. That would be a mistake that we don't want to see a new government make. And Mohammed, that goes to your point about the integration of both the autonomous administration, the Kurdish National Council, the other Kurdish parties in Syria as well, their unification and inclusion in some kind of framework really is the only guarantee at this point that a different governance model will be represented. Because we can look at Idlib, we can see how HTS has governed. Governing a larger and more diverse country will be different, and they have certainly made some statements suggesting that they're not going to pursue the most radical options that they could. But the fact remains that for religious freedom, for the rights of women, and of course for the participation of Kurdish people as well, the model that exists in Northeast Syria is the best chance at being a check and balance on some of the most extremist impulses that we're seeing from the new government. And it's also not foreign imposed. This is something that Syrian Kurds, Arabs, Christians, Yazidis, men, women built themselves. It attracted international support because it was very good at defeating ISIS, but this is a local Syrian model. And it's something that can be included. And I think especially to the point of, openly talking to everyone and lifting some of these sanctions, the sanctions and designations and any sort of broad-based policy stick that we use to sometimes hit actors in conflicts that we don't like. Refining and reevaluating the use of these types of policy tools is something that's going to be important right now for, as you mentioned, the sake of open discussion, the sake of dialogue, unification, allowing all Syrian political actors, including Syrian Kurdish ones, to participate, and for the recovery of the country. In the Northeast, which has a sanctions waiver, intended to ensure economic development to prevent a resurgence of ISIS, because of the conflict and because of overcompliance with broad sanctions on Syria, that waiver was never really implemented. I was once on a briefing where I had to open a Google Drive from my work email to share data with some officials that I was briefing. And I wasn't able to access it because, due to sanctions on Syria, Google business accounts do not work in that country. I'm not sure if these forms of overcompliance are something that are going to help, the brilliant, hardworking people of Syria rebuild their country. So these are all good points. I think people will be listening to them. And as we get towards the end of the panel, I see that we have some questions from the audience. A lot of this is related to kind of what we have gone into, but I know that, the two of you are very experienced on this. We have people listening who've got direct policy experience on this. So I'm happy to see the very specific questions. So for these recommendations that you've been making and that we've been discussing, what are sort of the specific actions or points of leverage that the US or the international community more broadly might have to be able to encourage Turkey to stop taking these actions, to encourage, we can broaden it, other Kurdish actors to work together, really to encourage, the kind of outcomes that both of you discussed in your comments?
Yusuf, do you want to go first?
Up to you, really.
Yeah,
Sure.
go ahead.
Okay. So I think one thing that the international community needs to, I think, understand when it comes to northern Syria, the Kurds in northern Syria, from the Turkish perspective, is that this is not just Erdogan. If you look at the opposition, not the Kurdish opposition, but the opposition in the broader sense, and the comments made by them or the policy proposals put forth by these political actors, is that there is this consensus on that there is a very legitimate security concern to Turkey from Syria. That's aside, as I said, aside from the Kurdish Dem Party, whether it's the Social Democratic CHP or the other parties, more smaller folks, smaller groups within the parliament, the consensus is that there's, and then so therefore it's going to be very hard to change. It's going to be it's hard to use other actors within Turkey to force Erdogan or change Ankar's perspective. Because you can't, there isn't that many actors that actually can be part of that conversation. You're not going to be able to encourage anybody within Turkey to actually, be much more peaceful towards the YPG or SDF or, all the actors in Syria. Or Kurdish actors. So I think, as Mohammed mentioned a couple times, actually, I think ensuring Turkey does get something else outside of outside of a political entity. Sorry, getting rid of a political entity in northern Syria, the Kurdish entity. Turkey is going to be involved in Ukraine, for example, and when Trump administration joins. Turkey is going to be involved in other discussions, whether it's Horn of Africa, whether it's Libya, and is already involved, obviously, but it's going to be much more, I assume it's going to be much more courageous and moving forward with its now increasing global popularity, whether that's legitimate or not. Turkish popularity in the global I don't know, public opinion seems to be at least in a more positive direction. However, what's going to happen with the Kurds is going to be a defining character, is going to define the character of the public image. But to I think to make myself more clear, I think Turkey when giving up its ambitious military strategy or goals in northern Syria is going to ask for more involvement in Ukraine and a potential ceasefire or peace deal that's going to happen potentially would happen under Trump administration. Turkey is definitely going to want not just be part of that conversation, but one of the key actors. And there could be a trade-off there because this is not an original suggestion. A lot of people think that's one of the reasons why Turkey is pushing it too much in Syria, not just in northern Syria, in Syria in general, in Damascus too, showing how they can be a global actor in conflicts as Syria, but beyond Syria. So I think that's going to be a very specific conversation moving forward, especially under Trump administration. The other thing is going to come down to Trump and Erdogan's personal relationship, because friends or not, they have a very personalized relationship. They had one between 2016 and 2020. If you recall, there was a lot of exchanges, whether through phone or the letter, and similar stuff. And I think one of the first conversations Trump is going to have when he takes office in the beginning in a couple of weeks, actually, is that he's going to call Erdogan and talk about northern Syria. That's one of the conversations that they're going to have. And unfortunately, their personal relationship is going to matter moving forward. And that's a big question mark right there, and at least from my perspective. So I think I'm going to stop there, but
Yeah, that's all very helpful, particularly the idea of how continuities and relationships between these conflicts might be used to promote balance. So yeah, Mohammed, your ideas about sort of specific actions, points of leverage.
Sure. Well, just to add to what Yusuf said, with regard to the incoming Trump administration, I think apart from the valid comments that Yusuf made about the personal relationship between Trump and Erdogan, other members of the future administration, at least the ones who have been nominated and picked so far, and I'm sort of talking mostly about people like Senator Marco Rubio or Congressman Mike Waltz in their future capacities as the Secretary of State, if Rubio is going to be confirmed, and Waltz at the National Security Council. These people understand the broader strategic value of the U.S. Involvement, military deployment to Syria. They have shown or made statements in the past supporting Syrian Kurds, and they are also the kind of people who are more broadly very much enthusiastic about preserving and developing US's relationship with its allies in the region, be that Israel or the Gulf Arab states, Jordan and others. So I think all of that would create a picture that also, adding to that, the statement that we have seen over the past few days from Congress members, Senator Graham, Senator Van Hollen, outside of the, personal relationship between Trump and Erdogan, I think there is a significant amount of pressure, or there will be a significant amount of pressure on Turkey to sort of not attack the Syrian Kurdish areas, and ideally to try to broker some sort of a working relationship, as unpleasant as it might be to both parties in Syria and Turkey at the moment. And in terms of the specific tools, what we have seen in the past, the U.S. has used the F-35 warplanes program as a sort of instrument of leverage against Turkey. There has been renewed talk over the past several days by some Congress members about imposing or reimposing sanctions on Turkey, even though we don't really know anything about the details or the extent of those sort of sanctions. But the question of sanctions on Syria itself, the sanctions remaining from the Assad era are also very important for Turkey, because the way that the future of reconstructing Syria and rebuilding the infrastructure of the country that has been really greatly damaged, the way that it looks in that Turkish businesses, and companies are poised to be the one that will be reaping the benefit. They are going to be the main, sort of outside businesses, industries going into Syria. They have the knowledge, they have the resources, and they would be definitely very keen to capitalize on the massive opportunity for business that will emerge in Syria. However, the existing U.S. sanctions on Syria can complicate that. So, that would be also one of the other likely tools of leverage that the U.S. can or should have, or should use in order to, to convince Turkey to basically refrain from its military operations in northeast Syria, and ideally, as I said before, sit down at the negotiating table with the Syrian Kurds and, try to work this out amicably.
Absolutely. I think those are all important points of leverage as well. And I think, look, when we see both Trump's statements and instincts on this issue, and his statements while campaigning about wanting to end, endless wars and bring peace in the region, however sincere or not sincere that is, I think that there's a way to balance that with what we're seeing from his appointees and certainly from the bipartisan perspective in Congress about the importance of supporting Northeast Syria, because at the end of the day, what we see in terms of the transnational Kurdish issue, the Palestinian issue, even the conflict in Syria is that frozen conflicts unfreeze. If the underlying grievance, if the underlying cause of conflict is still there, the renewal of conflict can certainly be delayed for a long time by the massive use of force, by the kinds of policies that these states have been using, but it doesn't make the issue go away as often as sometimes policymakers would like. And conflict can restart and shift rapidly in terms of dynamics in a very short period of time. And so finding a sustainable solution for the Syrian Kurds, for Northeast Syria, and for the wider regional accommodation between Turkey and Kurdish groups as well, is in the interests of, I think, any government that wants to wind down US involvement and end conflicts in a way that, unlike, for example, when we look at Iraq, doesn't leave the US having to rush in 5-10 years later with another excuse to intervene and another need to address serious security threats. So sustainable solutions are in everyone's interests. The developments that we're seeing across the region are showing that. And I think that the ideas the both of you have put forward today are part of a conversation on what those sustainable solutions can look like in this very difficult time. So Mohammed and Yusuf, I want to thank you both very much for your comments and evaluations. I want to thank all of our viewers as well for joining the panel and for those questions. So that is the last question. I'm going to wrap it up now. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to continuing these conversations. You can, of course, follow more of our work on this and many other subjects at kurdishpeace.org. So Yusuf Can and Mohammed Salih, thank you so much for speaking. Thanks again to our audience. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
You too.